Silence feels uncomfortable not because it's awkward, but because the brain interprets it as uncertainty. When conversations go quiet, the brain begins scanning for meaning. It looks for cues, intentions, and social signals. And when it finds none, it fills the gap itself. Silence removes external reference points. Without sound or feedback, the brain loses context and begins compensating internally. This reaction is not a personal quirk. It's a shared neurological response. In moments of silence, the brain increases alertness. This response evolved to detect uncertainty, not comfort. The brain is wired to avoid informational gaps, often filling them with small talk or nervous behavior. This discomfort follows a predictable psychological pattern. Cultural conditioning reinforces this response. In many environments, silence is treated as disengagement rather than neutrality, reinforcing avoidance over time. This response reflects deeper psychological and cultural conditioning. From a neurological perspective, silence activates threat detection systems. The brain evolved to associate a lack of information with potential risk. Even when no danger is present, the response still activates in modern contexts. The mind compensates by generating internal activity, thoughts, worries, and distractions. Personal history also shapes this response. For people who grew up in loud or emotionally unpredictable environments, silence can feel unsafe. Not because it is, but because it was once associated with instability. In some cultures, silence is seen as a sign of respect, or a way to show contemplation. In others, it's viewed as awkward or uncomfortable. Such experiences can create lasting associations between silence and emotional instability. Silence is not just the absence of sound. It is a complex phenomenon that reveals how people interpret uncertainty and connection. By understanding our discomfort with silence, we can begin to appreciate its value, using it as a tool for reflection, or as a way to connect with others on a deeper level. Silence isn't the absence of connection. It's the absence of certainty. Once that distinction is understood, quiet moments stop feeling threatening and start becoming informative. Being ignored doesn't just feel unpleasant. The brain processes it in the same regions associated with physical pain. When social signals disappear, the brain doesn't interpret it as neutral. It interprets it as loss of connection. Human brains evolved to depend on social inclusion for survival. For most of history, being ignored meant being excluded from protection, resources, or support. That threat is still encoded neurologically. From a neurological perspective, social rejection activates the anterior cingulate cortex. This is the same region involved in processing physical pain. The brain does not fully distinguish between physical injury and social exclusion. Both signal potential danger. Both demand attention. When someone is ignored, the brain begins searching for explanation. Did something go wrong? Was a signal missed? Is the connection unstable? When no answer appears, uncertainty increases. And uncertainty heightens stress responses. This is why being ignored often leads to rumination. The mind attempts to regain control by replaying interactions, tone, and timing. Not to self-punish, but to restore predictability. Cultural conditioning can intensify this response. In environments where responsiveness signals respect or value, silence is interpreted as dismissal. Over time, being ignored becomes associated not just with distance, but with rejection. Personal history also shapes how deeply this response is felt. For people who experienced inconsistent attention or emotional withdrawal early in life, being ignored can feel especially destabilizing. Not because the situation is severe, but because the nervous system recognizes the pattern. Being ignored is painful not because of ego, but because the brain treats social disconnection as a threat to safety. Once this is understood, the reaction becomes easier to observe without self-blame. Being ignored isn't a failure of worth. It's a disruption of certainty. And when certainty returns, the pain fades. Overthinking doesn't happen because the mind is weak. It happens because the brain is trying to regain certainty. When information feels incomplete, the brain does not stay idle. It begins generating possibilities, interpretations, and outcomes. Not to confuse, but to resolve. The human brain evolved to predict what happens next. Prediction reduces risk. Uncertainty increases it. When a situation lacks clear resolution, the brain remains active. It continues scanning for meaning, patterns, and explanations. Overthinking is the result of that unresolved scan. From a neurological perspective, uncertainty keeps threat detection systems engaged. The brain treats unanswered questions as potential risk. Not because danger is present, but because it cannot be ruled out. This is why overthinking often intensifies at night. External distractions fade. Internal signals become louder. The mind begins replaying conversations, decisions, and future scenarios. Not as self-criticism, but as an attempt to predict and prevent error. Overthinking feels uncontrollable because the brain has not received a stopping signal. Certainty acts as closure. Without it, the loop continues. Cultural conditioning can reinforce this pattern. In environments where mistakes carry consequences, mental rehearsal becomes a form of protection. Thinking ahead becomes associated with safety. Over time, the brain learns that constant analysis reduces uncertainty, even when it doesn't. The habit remains. Personal history also shapes this response. For people who experienced unpredictability or pressure early in life, overthinking can feel necessary. Not because it helps, but because it once did. Overthinking is not a failure of discipline. It is a signal that the brain is searching for resolution. Once uncertainty is reduced, mental noise decreases naturally. Not through force, but through understanding. Overthinking isn't the mind losing control. It's the mind waiting for certainty. And when certainty arrives, the loop releases. Letting go feels hard. Not because you're attached, but because the brain treats unresolved experiences as unfinished tasks. The brain is built to seek closure. When something ends without clarity, it stays active in memory. This isn't emotional weakness. It's how attention systems work. From a neurological perspective, unresolved situations keep cognitive circuits engaged. The brain assumes there is still something to learn, fix, or prepare for. Letting go feels unsafe when meaning is incomplete. The mind asks, was there a lesson? A mistake? A signal that mattered? Without answers, the brain resists release. It holds the experience close. Not to cause pain, but to prevent repetition. This is why closure doesn't always come from explanation. Sometimes clarity increases attachment instead of reducing it. Personal history plays a role. When past experiences lacked resolution, the nervous system learns to stay alert longer than necessary. Letting go becomes delayed, not avoided. The shift happens when the brain stops expecting a solution. When an experience is reclassified as complete, even without understanding. Letting go is not forgetting. It is signaling safety. Once the brain believes nothing more is required, attention disengages. The mind moves forward. Not because the past disappeared, but because it no longer demands vigilance. And when vigilance ends, release follows naturally. Emotional numbness doesn't happen because feelings disappear. It happens because the brain reduces emotional output to maintain stability. When emotional signals become overwhelming, the nervous system shifts strategy. Instead of reacting, it dampens. This is not avoidance. It is regulation. From a neurological perspective, emotional numbness occurs when the brain prioritizes control over intensity. Strong emotional signals increase uncertainty, and uncertainty activates threat systems. When the system stays activated for too long, the brain limits input. Emotions become quieter, not absent, contained. This response is often misunderstood as disconnection, but it is closer to compression. The brain narrows emotional range to prevent overload. Personal history can make this response more likely. For people who learned that emotional expression led to instability, numbness becomes a protective baseline. The nervous system learns that feeling less feels safer. Over time, this state becomes familiar. Not because it is ideal, but because it is predictable. Emotional numbness is not the opposite of feeling. It is the brain's attempt to regain equilibrium. The shift begins when safety no longer requires suppression. When emotions can rise without overwhelming the system. Numbness fades. Not through force, but through stability. Feeling returns when the brain no longer needs to stay guarded, and when protection is no longer required. Experience opens again. Uncertainty is not uncomfortable because it's confusing. It's uncomfortable because the brain treats missing information as a threat. When outcomes are unclear, the brain does not remain neutral. It begins preparing for danger. Human brains evolved in environments where uncertainty often meant risk. Not knowing what would happen next could signal hidden danger, loss, or harm. That association is still active today. From a neurological perspective, uncertainty increases activity in threat detection systems. The brain becomes hypervigilant, scanning for patterns, signals, and meaning. Clear negative information is often easier for the brain to process than ambiguity. Bad news defines a boundary. Uncertainty leaves the boundary open. When outcomes remain unknown, the brain struggles to predict what actions are safe. This prediction failure increases cognitive load and physiological stress. The mind responds by attempting to resolve the uncertainty. It searches for answers, scenarios, and explanations, often repeatedly. This is why uncertainty fuels worry. Not because the situation is severe, but because the brain is trying to restore predictability. Cultural conditioning can amplify this response. In environments that value control, clarity, or constant feedback, uncertainty is treated as failure rather than neutrality. Over time, uncertainty becomes associated not just with discomfort, but with loss of safety. Personal history also shapes this response. For individuals who experienced instability or inconsistent outcomes early in life, uncertainty can feel especially distressing. Not because the present situation is dangerous, but because the nervous system recognizes the pattern. Uncertainty stresses the brain because it blocks prediction. And prediction is how the brain maintains a sense of safety. Once this is understood, uncertainty becomes easier to tolerate without panic. Uncertainty is not danger. It is simply the absence of resolution. And when resolution arrives, the stress response quiets. Waiting for certainty feels harder than facing a bad outcome. Not because uncertainty is dangerous, but because the brain struggles to stay unprepared. When the outcome is unclear, the mind cannot settle. It stays alert, scanning for signals that haven't arrived yet. From a neurological perspective, uncertainty keeps the brain's threat system active. The amygdala remains engaged, not reacting to danger, but anticipating it. This state is metabolically expensive. The brain uses more energy when it cannot predict what comes next. Certainty, even negative certainty, allows the nervous system to recalibrate. Uncertainty does not. This is why people often rush decisions they're not ready for. Why silence feels heavier than rejection. Why waiting feels worse than knowing. The brain evolved to minimize unknowns. Not because every unknown is dangerous, but because unresolved possibilities require constant monitoring. Over time, prolonged uncertainty leads to mental fatigue. Attention fragments. Emotional regulation weakens. The discomfort isn't impatience. It's cognitive overload. When certainty finally arrives, relief follows. Not because the outcome is good, but because the system can finally stand down. Understanding this doesn't remove uncertainty, but it changes how it's interpreted. Waiting isn't weakness. It's the nervous system holding readiness without resolution. And once resolution appears, the tension fades.
Emotional distance often feels more unsettling than conflict. Not because something is wrong, but because the brain struggles to interpret absence. When emotional signals decrease, the mind begins searching for explanation. Tone changes. Response time shifts. Presence feels reduced. From a neurological perspective, emotional distance creates informational gaps. The brain expects consistency in social connection. When that consistency breaks, uncertainty increases. The nervous system does not register emotional distance as neutral. It registers it as potential loss. Human brains evolved to rely on stable attachment cues. Closeness signaled safety. Distance signaled risk. That association remains active even in modern relationships. When emotional feedback becomes inconsistent, the brain increases monitoring behavior. Attention narrows. Interpretation intensifies. This is why emotional distance often leads to overanalysis. Not because the person is insecure, but because the brain is attempting to restore clarity. Silence combined with distance is especially destabilizing. Without feedback, the mind fills gaps on its own. Cultural expectations can amplify this response. In environments where emotional availability signals care, distance is interpreted as withdrawal. Over time, emotional distance becomes associated not just with space, but with disconnection. Personal history also shapes this reaction. For individuals who experienced inconsistent closeness early in life, emotional distance can feel especially threatening. Not because the present situation is dangerous, but because the nervous system recognizes the pattern. Emotional distance is distressing not because of attachment weakness, but because the brain is wired to detect relational instability. Once this is understood, the reaction becomes easier to observe without self-blame. Distance is not always rejection. It is often unresolved information. And when clarity returns, the tension softens.